In this video today, I wanted to discuss the current point, ambit, purpose of the UK military, why we would consider it basically worthless, and whether there's any remedy that we can do to address this situation. Now, to preface why the negative view rather than the neutral positive view on this current issue, I think is easy to explain through the usage of the statistics that the British government sought fit to publish and then brag about underneath one of their policy documents in the House of Commons. So in the document on the future soldier, and then there was another one on the state of the armed forces, they go into a bit of data on what they consider the strengths, the UK strengths. So you can see that here. So according to the British government, the defence and security of the nation is probably something that they should be proud about, with 3 billion intelligence agencies. They have the second highest defence spender in NATO and the highest in Europe. And we'll explore what that means about getting value for money in a bit. They've disrupted 28 terror attacks since 2017, which is a very interesting statistic when you consider that there were very few terrorist attacks from natives, most of them being non-natives. And then something about drugs, firearms, and other criminal enterprises. So I think there's a grouping here of what they consider defense to be national as well as international usage. But they also go on to say something about their soft power, which is a bit hilarious. They're third ranked in soft power in the world, for those who are not aware. Soft power is basically the usage of cultural means to balance global positioning. So if you think of America as the hegemony, and then smaller countries have their own cultural impacts, and that ranks them in such a way that we know about them, and they have a soft power, we call it, if it's music or television or literature, whatever. So they rank themselves third, brag about the BBC, and then they go on to say that there's a British Council operating in over 100 countries. Then lastly, they have here about being the fifth largest economy in the world, that the space industry generates 14 billion, nearly 15 billion pounds annually, and it's the third top destination for private technology investment, which is ahead of the rest of Europe. Bear in mind that this country was literally the most fearsome and well-regarded country in the globally in about 140 years ago. So in 140 years, a lot can change. This is potentially a misleading number, and misleading numbers for a lot of reasons. I think I would not probably have bragged about this to this degree given the state of the UK, because telling people how good everything is and then them living the reality of how crappy everything is paints a very duplicitous picture. You're not given what is the reflective wealth or well-being from a country and economy that should technically be performing at this level. And so we'll go into why. So this video is obviously based on only the armed forces today, and why should you care about the military? Why is it so important? I want to just read a few quotes here. One here from the works on Spengler, from how he considers military power, and then Carl Schmitt as well, and then a later one by Karl von Clausewitz, who was a Prussian general. So Spengler says, and this is important, I think, to just preface why armies are important: the degree of military power is dependent on the intensity of industry. Countries industrially poor are poor all around. They, therefore, cannot support an army or wage a war. Therefore, they are politically impotent, and, therefore, the workers in them, leaders and led alike, are pawns in the economic policy of their opponents. So this hopefully ensures the importance of this topic to you, and you regard the fact that being industrially mighty should and is correspondent to be a force power, politically, but militarily, globally. And this is how we can consider the impact of a country's presence. So it's not enough for, say, something like Singapore or Taiwan to have quite a large economic output when there's absolutely no chance they stand in an armed combat invasion, because the nature of war is such that you have to have an equivalent punching power, at least to a certain degree, with allies and things like that. So to have just only industry doesn't work as effectively as having, say, just military. It was said of the Prussian army in the 18th century that they owned a state, whereas most states owned an army. So it should give you kind of a forceful idea of why army takes precedence here, but is intrinsically linked to economics during our age. The second quote here by Schmidt, the development of military techniques appears to move in a direction which will perhaps permit only a few states to survive, i.e., those whose industrial potential would allow them to wage a promising war. Should smaller and weaker states be unable to maintain their independence by virtue of an appropriate alliance, they may be then forced, voluntarily or by necessity, to abdicate the just belly. And so Schmidt was also of this opinion that there's a legal linkage to what is the state and the state's requirement on sovereignty, as well as armed forces, projection, and how that interlinks to politics and war. This is a fairly common thread throughout most political and jurisprudence scholarship throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. And it's only recently that we've had this semi-formal understanding of an international legal guidance, like an ICC or a court that's based on, say, the UN principles of certain interactions that states are allowed to do, which is obviously only enforced by America, in that if you are to void certain topics, you do so under the assurances or under the threat of something from more or less America, but to a lesser degree, say, China or Russia. France and the UK, I think, have had the vestige of power, but the actual ability to project that power was lost to them in the Suez Canal and post that. Now, onto why the British Armed Forces in particular is impotent, now that we know it's important, such that we should be interested about it. Let me see if I can make myself a bit smaller here. So in January 2023, when the last report was done on the British military, we could see that they were able to gather some data. And the data says that there was 75,000 fully trained staff in the army, or like soldiers basically, which was smaller than the previous year. The total personnel in the forces was 190,000, smaller by about 3.5% from the previous year. But it also includes untrained personnel. And then the combined full-time trained strength of the Royal Navy, Marines and Air Force, and the full-time trained strength of the Army was 134,000, which was 1.9% smaller than the previous year. Obviously, the linearity of growth or decline here is fairly evident, that year on year you'll find a degradation in the capabilities of the armed forces in the UK. That's due to a multitude of reasons, some of which is in enticing young men to sign up, but it's also around how the structure of a modern military has much more focus around job training rather than actual force and armed personnel training and application. There's no wars, so it's very difficult to entice people who are interested in war to join the army, other than to be stationed somewhere in the peacekeeping role that most pacifist modern democracies are so fond of. You can see the discrepancy here, so it gives you at least a bit of context as to how big or small the UK Army and Armed Forces is. With 134,000 trained, we look at, this is in thousands, so this would be 1 million troops. You can see that there's been just a gradual decrease here from what was the Korean War, more or less in the 50s, through to even Gulf Wars and Afghanistan, etc., where there was just a flattening of the state of the armed forces from a personnel perspective. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, except if you consider the population graph interplaying with this armed forces personnel chart, because since 1900, you've had a doubling and tripling of the total population of Britain. So there's been fewer soldiers to more people. And you can actually kind of see that a little bit down here. I do have the chart of the population of England here. And you can see here that throughout the 1700s, it was fairly linear, and then you have a huge precipitous increase starting in the 1800s, where by the mid-1800s you had about 15 million. And if you include Ireland, Scotland, Wales, you probably had something more like 22, 23, all the way up to modern England having more than 50, 55 million. So the state of the army should be a semi-reflection on the number of people. In any good society, healthy society, you have a warrior class that tends toward being interested in participating in the armed forces and in war in general. There is a latent value that we all hold on the ability of war to make men, but also for men to have an outlet for their conflict, and that's why the army was always seen as a good place if you were a troublesome young lad, and if you were potentially a bit smarter, but also had a hankering for adventure, then that was also where you would go off to officer school with all the other privileged sons of usually aristos and other well-to-do people, couples. So in that, we did have quite a formal structure around the processes and the scheme of having a standardized funnel, more or less, of men going into what is the armed forces. Completely lost, obviously, in the modern age because of the armies. They've both had a lessening of the requirements to be a soldier. The nature of recruitment has been so bad that you need to lax your rules around what's required, particularly in terms of fitness. But also then you'll have an expansion, as with any bureaucracy, of the actual civil service that is attributed to this. You can see here in the same report that they've laid out what you have is 73,000 members of the regular army and 30,000 in reserve, and then you have 9,000 civil servants. So a 1 to 8 ratio, or a 1 to 7 ratio here almost, of civil servants to armed personnel. What is in effect one person helping manage 9 or 8 people. Even if you include the reserves there, it doesn't actually send that number up to any high level. So there's probably a bloated civil service here attached to the regular army and the reserves, and then a strategic reserve of 23,000, and we can assume these are definitely not fit for service unless there is an emergency, and in an emergency you will need much more than 23,000 people, I can assure you. So the idea that the British government has anything to brag about when it's preparedness, war preparedness, is a bit of a joke, and that's why showing and highlighting before that we are the third greatest economy and the second highest NATO contributor and the second highest spender in all of Europe gets you this. This is what it gets you. It gets you a bargain army from the cheap bin. An embarrassing farce, obviously, and that there needs to be some self-reflection here. Are you getting what you're paying for? Because obviously there's a massive disjoint between what is expected from a modern army, the current status, and where it's come from. And you've got a disjunction here between these three things. In any case, you can have a look here at the expenditure. What are you getting for this money that I've been telling you you're spending? I think it's fairly evident that salaries here should not inform a large part of your armed force spending. At the moment, technology reigns much more supreme. We can see from modern conflicts that there's a lot of trinkets and gadgets and modern weapons that cost a lot of money but actually save a lot of manpower and lives, etc. Particularly things like drones. Cyber intelligence becomes more important, so you need much more focus on hard tech and deep tech. And then modern equipment just comes from a almost oligopoly where there's only 2 or 3 firms for every type of weaponized technology. Therefore, you don't really have too much price flexibility because of the limitations you place on IP and restrictions on selling of arms in that way. You've conjured up an economic system which is very much based around price, and those prices become outrageous. Everyone's familiar with the American army being unable to procure pencils for less than, say, $100, things like this. And it's not even as ludicrous as obviously things and purchases done by NASA, which has even stricter requirements, so space and aerospace becomes even more of this oligopoly. Anyhow, in the UK, you are getting a lot of spend, but not much of it typically is going towards what I would consider an improvement of the army, more so just a continuation of it's on life support, so its last few heartbeats. The spend differential doesn't really tell us too much until we look at what it's being spent on from a quantitative perspective. Now, there's an interesting study done here between 1982 and 2018, where you can see, and this was during the Falklands, I think, but you can see here that the size of the armed forces was about 330,000 versus today, which was, it says 150 here because it's 2018. We now know it's actually even lighter. But the regular army is less than half now of the size of the army that was in 1982. And you have to remember that Britain hasn't necessarily undergone such a vast transformation psychologically in the sense that they stopped caring about war. Some of the most diehard war historians and philosophical warriors do still come out of England. There's a huge warrior race sitting connected to England in the way of Scotland, as well as what was the ex-British colony of Ireland. So you have a nature of warfare that's still embedded in the souls of a lot of these Gaels, you can call them Scots. And so in this, we can understand that there's not necessarily a problem with resources from a total market perspective. The addressable market of soldiers and potential soldiers is vast. It could be 2 to 3 million men would in some form or other be interested in serving in an army. But the type of army that you serve nowadays is not one that I think anybody wants to necessarily join, other than those who are deprived of other opportunities. There are very few historical families which can uphold enough of a legacy around joining the armed forces in that way, that my dad and my granddad and my great-granddad all served in the army or the navy. Therefore, I see it as a duty, which can be very, I'd say, noble, but at the same time, you lose a lot of that luster when you have such a joke of an armed forces and all the advertising that goes into the armed forces. I won't show it here, but it does not represent what is the ideal for a lot of these young men. The only exception to this is probably the special forces commandos, say Marines or something, where you have a very unique proposition of being an elite soldier, and that still has quite a lot of romanticism attached to it, where you can still have quite a lot of demand and supply. So that's probably the one saving grace of the British Army, is that it tends to still have quite a successful and attractive special forces commandos, who are actually obviously quite good at what they do. I would say they're one of the most elite in the world. So it's not that there's a quality issue at all. It's more or less in a holistic or grander sense that you want a standing army that's capable of actually winning a war, rather than really effective troops fighting small skirmishes. And the capacity of the army from a numerical point is much desecrated here by the lack, obviously, focus of consecutive governments and budgets. So you go from 900 tanks to 227, 467 to 185 warplanes. Remembering too that modern warfare is much more structured around mechanized vehicles, particularly in the space and on the sea. But still, tanks are very important. Attack submarines are about a quarter of what they used to be, from 27 down to 6. Warships, destroyers and frigates, from 60 down to 19. Carriers from 3 down to 1, which is undertaking trials as of 2018, so I'm not sure if it's been launched. And this is a flat-out embarrassment. I think you cannot claim to have a modern army without having aircraft carriers. It's just abysmal. And then nuclear-armed submarines, there's been a consistent number of 4 here. So as you can see, there's been a massive underinvestment and detraction of the army, a contraction of both personnel but also equipment. So this spend is enlarged from an inflationary point of view, in that you don't necessarily get more for the same price. But then also the things, typically equipment you're buying is more sophisticated, and this oligopoly system of more tech and higher tech means more cost and prices necessarily functions in a way to limit your capabilities as armed forces. And you go from being what was in this map here, a very offensive-driven army up until 1920, 1930. The British Army could be considered an offensive fighting force to a very defensive one in the Second World War, and Korean War was the display of what was supports for the American troops, down to what you would call a neutral or neutered army, where you serve, but there's very few practical reasons to deploy. So the idea is basically you're a support for what are smaller, as I said before, commandos, special forces, doing very important small tasks, and the rest of the army exists to make sure that they're capable of performing the missions, etc. This means that you need to overspend, and America is actually probably in some ways good at maintaining their focus militarily in the conversation in the budget. It doesn't become a second or third tier discussion topic. It retains its importance, and you see that in the reflection of how Americans feel about their military, even though it goes down this same ideological dirt track where you have a, I don't want to say scandalization, but you have what is a tarnish of the appeal from a advertising point of view. It is very hard to get people excited for wars which aren't glorious and honorable. And having successive wars, as America has had, meddling in Middle Eastern conflicts does not engender a lot of support in the average Ohio or Iowan farm boy. Further say the point here, when we talk about international armed force spending, this chart here, which is in log form, shows the spend per capita, and that the UK is not even top 6 here, so that should be informing of how ludicrously low the spending is per capita. But here you can see that China has obviously come from what was a very low to much more reasonable level of spending per capita on their armed forces. China's biggest issue is that they spend much more money on internal security because of the way that their government is structured. You have a need to suppress and oppress your population, and to do that you need an armed forces which is trained in civil war, basically, or civil, but the civilian side of ensuring safety and peace. Their military there is hampered quite a lot by that internal strife, or the prevention of internal strife, whereas the American armed forces is much more about being world police. So it's still a fairly offensive-driven army versus the more defensive version of China. France, commendable enough, still spends quite a bit, even though it's clearly here not an important and growing preference for them. And then the Saudis spending or outspending almost everyone in terms of growth percentages other than China. So you can see that the potential is always there for the industrious countries with a lot of money, Japan, France, Russia, Saudi Arabia, China, and the USA. And this is where you would think the UK would be interested to spend an adequate amount to represent what should be a fighting force capable of both defending itself but also launching an offensive should the need arise. And at the moment they rely quite heavily on what is the nuclear assured destruction, so that why spend money on a armed forces which is notionally defensive because we have nuclear weapons? They thereby omits or circumvents the need to have an army at all, basically, which logically I can definitely fathom to a degree. I just think then take it to its logical conclusion and get rid of everyone who's not arming a nuclear weapon, because what is the point then? Well, clearly there is a point to having a standing army, in which case wouldn't you want a good one rather than an inadequate one? And this is driven home even more here by the same style of graph on the spending per capita, where you have the total spend on each soldier from a per capita stance at being $1,800 for a US soldier being spent per person towards their own defense. Saudi Arabia is a bit of an outlier here, and I think that's obviously because their national income is more or less oil, and you can make your own conclusions about where that money comes from anyway. You have Germany, South Korea here being pitifully low. South Korea too, because they're considered to be neighboring what is their largest enemy. I would expect this to be much higher, but once again, they rely on Big Brother USA to do their defense. China being representative here of what would be an inadequate spend, you would think, from an economy that's supposed to be number 2 in the world. Russia being nowhere near as threatening either. They can obviously get some things cheaper, but being cheap in war no longer works as an effective tool. You can't send wave after wave of Siberian peasant at a trench. As you can see in the Ukraine, it does not work. It is not an effective tactic in this century. Afghanis had a better time out of showing and displaying the opposite effect here of very few men living in mountains and caves can defend entire armed barracks and battalions in certain ways. So it's very important to understand money here being spent has to both be A, a lot, and B, smartly spent. This is very difficult for a government to do, by the way. This is not, I'm not painting an easy picture, it's more of a simple picture. There's how much you spend and where it gets spent. And those two things need to be high if you want to project force in a way that's actually threatening. The UK at the moment does neither. They spend their very scant amounts of money poorly. And that has ramifications. And I think it's just very insincere to pretend like it shouldn't be a huge and important topic in the House of Commons to be discussed. And it's only ever given lip service. You'll see Starmer and before him Sunak up there saying, yes, we believe in armed forces. We remember them on this day, and they do all the, as I say, lip service, but it's very hollow. There's nothing about it which strikes you with impact on, yes, they're actually gearing towards being a first-tier nation again. The scent or the stink of decline sticks to a country in a way that's indelible. You really need to have an entire focus and thesis in a governing party on let's increase and grow our country's armed forces because we want to actually be a threat again. And then people hear that and they think you're a warmonger, and particularly so, I think, because American neocons and elites have been war hawks in a saber-rattling, obnoxious way. And they have probably put the worst spin on war in general to the grander populace to show, yes, we want to fight all these wars, and then end up trying to get into a trench pitched battle in Afghanistan does nothing for anybody's reputation and also thoughts on, would I want my son to go and die in the sands of Afghanistan or Iraq or Libya or Syria? No, no one wants that for their loved ones. It's vastly different to have at least an ideological war bent on a communism versus capitalism. At least in a war like that, you have I don't want to say soul, but you have a ethos around performance, and it gives you, it galvanizes you into greater action and bold displays of bravery, versus what you have is a ostensibly peacekeeping affair or a targeted mission to overthrow a sovereign government for no other reason than you don't like the way that they rule, which is extremely weak casus belli. The third or some other auxiliary impacts here of declining country is that 22,000 British Army troops were found overweight and had health problems. So more than 32,000 soldiers failed the British Army fitness test. As you can see here, that fitness is no longer a primary decision factor into apparently being inducted into the army and thereby being able to maintain your fighting fitness, as it were. The idea that an army can be full of people who are incapable of actually surviving a war from a fitness perspective is very harrowing. I think there should be much more discussion around overall slovenly and lackadaisical effort towards physical fitness. That's in the general populace, let alone in the men and women protecting our country. It's, I think, maybe understated how impactful being a culture which is body positive completely ruins anyone's idea of what fitness actually means from a atavistic standpoint. What was the ideal hunter-gatherer it was a man who was very physically fit because he was able to both defend his family and tribe, but also hunt wild game. Here you have so many donuts and so few sit-ups that 1/3 or a quarter, nearly 1/3 of your entire armed forces are tubby. And so these ponderous soldiers rolling towards you on the battlefield is unlikely to stop anyone in their tracks. I think it's just a function, once again, of having low standards, and low standards is a correspondent coefficient to having lack of care and the lack of purpose. And the British Army, once again, was but throughout its reformation in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, geared towards a colonial goal. And as Britain expanded, so did the remit and its ambit. And to have that corresponding feeling of I'm joining an army which is going out purposefully to do things, as well as the consequential, if we win, the victor's spoils are divvied up amongst the troops. So the nature of warfare used to be that pillaging and spoiling and garnering booty from a battle was par for the course. So you could end up being quite a wealthy citizen post your military career. If you were a Navy sailor or a seaman, you would be able to take part in what were divvied up profits from spoils of war, which includes ships that you captured and anything on board, things like that. But the equivalent for the armed troops, the soldiers in the army who were able to participate in India or in America or in Africa, there was usually spoils amongst the aftermath of the war, things like money, gold, trinkets. That's gone. Obviously, you have a professional fighting force now, which is paid a salary. The salary is exceptionally low. I would never join the British Army to be a wealthy person. Even the generals that you do have are not paid very well. And you could say it's emblematic in that if I asked you, unless you've served in the army, name one single British general that currently serves, or name an admiral, or name an air marshal. Off the top of your head, could you name one? Where I would say most of you who are interested in, British military history could name several historical leaders, generals, field marshals, etc. Whereas current standing, no one cares because they're so ineffectual as a fighting force. Their names don't correspond to anything. It's unimportant to know who these people are. You'll find kids much more focused on who's playing in the first 15 of their favorite rugby team, first 11 of their favorite cricket team, than it is the general that's supposed to be what was a celebrity back in the day, to the degree that you could be prime minister if you were, say, someone like Arthur Wellesley. I think the combination, therefore, or thereby of really abysmal pay and then no honour is the two-barreled shotgun that was used to shoot the British Army in the head, if you understand the analogy. From a conceptual standpoint, there's no appeal. There's no romanticism about joining the army, except for that tiny slither of if I'm good enough to make the special forces and get sent on cool missions on the SAS, or if I'm inducted into the MI6 and I can be James Bond. These are what you're resting your entire military credentials on. Two very small and insignificant portions of real force projection. And so why exist as a country anymore if you won't project force? You may well as be, and basically are, a vassal for the United States, which is the only country in the world at the moment that can actually show itself as applying the necessary force. And that's why they are the hegemony. It's that nature in themselves to be what is the only functioning army from a technology and spending standpoint. It does need to be 5% of your GDP. There's no way around that. You can't cheapen out like Germany and still be expected to be taken seriously. Germany is a non-entity, a non-country, and tries to use its economic leverage in ways that cannot replace an army. It is flat out embarrassing, and this would be a call to all Germans to seriously reflect on the dismal state of your military, both armed forces, but also the way that your civilian population treats the army. they're embarrassed almost about what would be a 1,000 year of admirable history, just because they obviously are the losers of 2 world wars. I guess the last part here is to maybe focus on the conceptual nature, and so von Clausewitz has what is a personal appeal. He was obviously a Prussian general, so had the admittance that the army was fulfilling, and he, as he put it quite rightly, that war was a pursuit of politics by other means. He says here that the personalities of statesmen and soldiers are such important factors that in war, above all, it is vital not to underrate them. Which is to show you that quality of soldiering is much more important than quantity, but only if you have the choice of both. Whereas at the moment, you don't get quality or quantity. You get the offcuts of a deprived situation, or like the guys signing up are basically from poor backgrounds and or have an idea of what the army would be like, and almost all of them are disillusioned by it after joining. You have very low re-up rates after their service is completed. And the reason for that is the structure of the army in peacetime on a pacifist level is demotivating. It's not something anyone wants to see. Oh yeah, I want to go out and sweep the yard 15 times every day for 4 years, or sleep in a huge barracks for the next 15 years when you'll be stationed in small islands with no access to anything other than your iPad and a online girlfriend. It's not a lifestyle anyone wants, except if you offered them something like glory or something like riches. 2 things you can't do when you're an impoverished military vassal. The last one, I think, from a practical point of view. So conceptually, we can hopefully understand why it's an embarrassment. But conceptually, here is the kicker. In the new future soldier, as they call them, they wanted to strip away policies that were blocking people from the military. I'm sure some were warranted and some were gratuitous, but in general, a lowering of standards almost never works out well. But nevertheless, I think the streamlining effect here of recruiting cyber specialists, don't get me wrong, is definitely a good thing, but then specifically top gamers is not going to do much for increasing fitness standards. Now, I don't want to badmouth gamers. I play video games myself. But in general, I think the misapprehension here from and this is a very boomer and almost Gen X way of understanding the younger generations, is that if we can make the military cool, then we can trick these guys into coming to be employed by us. So they can, instead of coding for Google, will come code for the armed forces because we can make it cool and we can offer these benefits. But no one in their right mind who is talented at what they do, other than if they have a insane level of duty in that they feel accomplished only when they're contributing to their country that they hold dear, which is very difficult in peacetime, would ever join the British Army to code. And the guys who are gaming are not gaming for the reasons that they want to drive a drone around and shoot civilians in Libya or Syria. This is not the function of what most guys... There are some gamers who might do that, but they are not the ones that you are going to employ in the army because they won't pass the psychological test. So you're going to have a mismatch here of skill set. And then once again, you're introducing men who are not built for war into what is required of them out of war and potential war. If you are self-admitting that war will never occur because we have the nuclear threat, then by all means, hire 25,000 overweight British gamers and call it an army. That's, I think, as far as you get in terms of admittance. But on the one last embarrassing note here, the British government itself admits that there's a serious shortfall of personnel in combat units, which is why only three out of more than 20 infantry battalions have manning levels above 70 to 80%. It's such a shame that the most decorated and valorous fighting force over the last 400 years has been devastated, and it's thus transpired to a degree of being incapable, I would say, of even defending itself from its neighbours historical enemies France, which should tell you everything that there is to know about the state of the British Armed Forces.